I've got a question this morning.
Imam eno vprašanje tega jutra.
How many of you actually preach?
Koliko od vas je že pridigalo ali govorilo?
Maybe about a third of you.
Mogoče četrtina, več četrtina od vas.
How many think that God might call you to preach?
Koliko od vas mogoče misli, da vas bo Gospod poklical?
No, there are some of those too. Praise God.
Ja, slava Gospodu zdaj.
In the remaining lectures,
V preostalih predavanjih
we will be looking at more technical aspects.
bomo gledali bolj iz tehnične perspektive.
Last night there was a lot of the spiritual side.
Včeraj smo bolj pogledali iz duhovne strani.
The spiritual preparation of the preacher.
Iz duhovne strani, kako se pripravi govornik.
And that is something that we can all appreciate.
In to je nekaj, kar lahko vsi cenimo.
We're going to get more technical now.
Danes pa bomo veliko bolj tehnično,
More practical.
bolj praktično.
What it actually means to put good sermons together.
Kaj pravzaprav pomeni sestaviti dobro pridigo
And how we can actually set about that task.
in kako lahko to naredimo, kako se lahko zastavimo ta cilj.
But last night, time prevented us from quite finishing this area of the preparation of the preacher as a man.
Včeraj nam se je iztekel čas, da nismo mogli dokončati, kako se Božji človek pripravi za...
We were talking about how important it is for the preacher to know the background of his listeners.
Kako pomembno je, da pridigar ve ozadje svojih poslušalcev, če jim govori.
And we also talked about the pastoral knowledge.
Tudi govorili smo o pastoralnem znanju.
The pastor needs to know
Pastor mora vedeti,
what is the spiritual state of his people.
kakšno je duhovno stanje njegovih ljudi,
He
katerih
needs to
govori.
know a lot about their lives.
Mora veliko vedeti o njihovih življenjih.
Otherwise, his preaching will go off somewhere that has nothing to do with
Ker
it.
drugače bo njegovo govorištvo bo šlo nekaj dela daleč stran.
The first time I went to Prekmurje
Prvič, ko sem šel v Prekmurje,
was a pastor's conference.
je bila pastorska konferenca.
Must have been in the early 1980s.
To je bilo mogoče zgodnjih 80-ih.
There were 3 people there.
Tam so bili 3 ljudje, 3 osebe.
Charles Greenaway, Gordon Fee, and Paul Berish.
Te osebe so bile.
It was a really blessed time for me.
Je bil zelo blagoslovljen čas za mene.
And I enjoyed listening to the preaching of these 3 men.
In sem užival poslušati te 3 možje.
And I translated some of them into Croatian.
In nekatere sem prevajal v hrvaščino.
I remember Greenaway telling us a story.
In se spominjam, kako je rekel eno zgodbo.
He was preaching in Africa.
On je pridigal v Afriki.
And he had a visit from America.
In imel je en obisk iz Amerike.
And when this man opened his notes to preach,
In ko je ta odprl svoje zapiske, pridigal,
Greenaway thought to himself, this message is not going to go with these people at all.
in se je ta Greenaway mislil, to nikamor ne bo šlo s temi ljudmi.
So this man preached a message that would have been fine in some American suburban church.
Ja, ta človek iz Amerike je govoril, kar bi mogoče delovalo v Ameriki, v nekaterih cerkvah.
But he had several hundred people in front of him,
Ampak on je imel nekaj 100 ljudi pred seboj.
completely naked.
Čisto nagi so bili.
And from a totally different culture.
Čisto iz druge kulture.
Anyway, this brother preached his sermon.
In ta brat je povedal si pridigo.
And Greenaway had the task of translating him into the African language.
In Greenaway ga je prevajal v afriškem jeziku.
So he decided to preach his own sermon.
In se odločil, da bo govoril svojo pridigo.
And he preached to them.
In on jim je govoril
about the big tribal chief in the sky.
o velikem ena skupina, plemenska skupina.
In the sky, who saw the people down on earth, how they were behaving badly.
O velikem plemenu, ki gleda dol iz neba na zemljo, kako se grdo
And
obnašajo.
how he said, I must help these people to live better.
In so rekli, moramo pomagati tem ljudem, da
So
bodo
what did
boljši.
he do? He sent his son,
In kaj naredil je, da je poslal svojega sina.
and so on and so on.
In tako naprej, in tako naprej.
And at the end of the sermon,
In na koncu pridige
the American guy made an appeal.
je ameriški govornik naredil en klic.
And he said, who would like to receive this Christ?
In je rekel, kdo bi rad sprejel tega Kristusa.
And hundreds responded.
In na stotine se jih je odzvalo.
And afterwards he said to Greenaway,
In na koncu je rekel Greenwayu.
he said, I preached that sermon in many parts of the world,
In je rekel, jaz sem govoril to pridigo na različnih mestih sveta.
but it's never had the effect that it's having.
In nikoli ni imel takega efekta kot tukaj.
So you really have to know who you're preaching to.
Torej, res je, moraš vedeti ljudi, poznati jih, katerim govoriš.
And earlier we talked about evangelism and discipleship.
Prej smo tudi govorili o evangelizmu, evangelizaciji in delati učence.
The two great tasks of the Great Commission.
Dve pomembni stvari, točki, ki morajo delati vsak.
Now, theologians talk about kerugma and didache.
Teologi govorijo o kerugma in didache.
These are two Greek words.
To sta dve grški besedi.
I don't know whether you've got Greek words in your text, do you?
A imate te grške besede zapisane v svojih knjigah?
They're two Greek words.
To sta dve grški besedi.
One New Testament scholar analyzed the evangelistic sermons in Scripture.
En novozavezni učitelj je preučil to.
And he discovered that there were certain basic things that were repeated.
In da so nekatere stvari, ki se ponavljajo.
Jesus had come, lived his life,
Jezus je prišel, živel je svoje življenje,
died on the cross
umrl na križu
for our sins,
za naše
and
grehe,
rose again,
spet ostane od mrtvih,
that we might have forgiveness of sins and eternal life.
da bi lahko imeli odpuščanje grehov in imeli večno življenje.
That's the kerygma.
To je kerugma.
And that is the message we need to proclaim to those who do not know Christ.
In to je sporočilo, kateri moramo oznanjevati tistim, ki ne poznajo Kristusa.
Now, I spent some time teaching religious education in a school in England.
Preživel sem nekaj časa, sem učil v šolah religijski oziroma religijski predmet.
The children were not interested at all.
In učenci sploh niso bili zainteresirani to,
They were not converted.
ker niso bili
They
spreobrnjeni.
couldn't see the point of teaching.
Niso videli smisla tega učenja.
And people do not see, until they're born again, they don't see the importance of teaching.
In ljudje, ki niso ponovno rojeni, ne vidijo pomembnosti tega učenja.
So anyway, I was trying to teach these children, getting nowhere.
In jaz sem učil te otroke in nikamor nismo šli.
And then an evangelist came into the school.
In potem je en evangelist prišel na to šolo.
Now, I wasn't allowed to do this in the class.
In jaz ni mi bilo dovoljeno, da to naredim.
But he
v šoli.
preached the kerygma.
Ampak ta evangelist je govoril
And he challenged them.
in jih je izval.
And they listened to him like this.
In so ga tako poslušali.
Why?
Zakaj?
Because you need to know who you're preaching to.
Ker moraš vedeti ljudi, katerim govoriš.
If people are not born again,
Če ljudje niso ponovno
if
rojeni,
they have not grasped the message of the kerygma,
če niso spoznali tega sporočila kerugma,
they're not ready for the didache, which is the teaching.
sploh niso pripravljeni za drugo sporočilo didache, kar je učenje.
And so I believe that preaching in our churches
Jaz verjamem, da je učenje v naših crkvah,
should be maybe something like 2/3 teaching for the believers,
da bi mogli biti 2/3, da govorimo za vernike,
but we should always try to have an element of the gospel.
in da bi vedno vseboval element evangelija, kerugme,
So that those who are maybe listening for the first time
da tisti, ki so mogoče prvič, da poslušajo to,
can hear the message of the gospel.
da lahko slišijo sporočilo evangelija.
Now then, that brings us to the next thing, the characteristics of good preaching.
In to nas pripelje do naslednje točke, karakteristike dobrega govorništva.
We need to think about this.
Moramo o tem razmisliti.
As a young preacher,
Kot mlad pridigar
for me it was a bit like a lottery.
je bilo za mene kot ena loterija.
Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't.
Enkrat deluje, enkrat ne.
And I had no way of knowing how or why.
In nisem imel pojma, kako in zakaj ne.
And over the years,
In čez nekaj let
I have learned to analyze these elements.
sem malo analiziral te elemente.
And this is a tremendous help.
In to je zelo mi pomagalo.
I've been preaching for a long time now.
Zelo dolgo sem v svojem življenju že
I
pridigal.
still have bad days.
Še vedno imam slabe dni.
I think maybe the sermon's okay.
Mogoče si mislim, ja, pridigal v
And
redu.
when I preach it, it just doesn't go that well at all.
In ko jo govorim, ni šlo tako, kot bi moglo.
But what I have now, I can analyze
Ampak kaj imam zdaj, da lahko analiziram,
why it was
zakaj je bilo,
that it didn't go,
da ni šlo dobro.
that it wasn't a blessing to the people.
Zakaj ni bil blagoslov ljudem.
And this is important to learn to analyze what makes preaching powerful and effective.
In to je pomembno analizirati, kaj naredi pridiganje močno.
And the first thing I want to mention is the importance of the biblical base.
In prvo, kar bi rad omenil, je, da tukaj je pomembno svetopisanski temelj.
You remember we talked about the messenger and the ambassador.
Veste, da smo govorili o prenašalcu sporočila, o ambasadorju.
We need to base our preaching firmly on the Bible.
Naše pridiganje mora biti temeljno na Svetem pismu.
In my early years of preaching,
Če v mojih letih pridiganja
here in former Yugoslavia,
v bivši Jugoslaviji
I was very controversial.
sem bil zelo kontroverzen.
People didn't know what to make of me.
Ljudje niso vedeli, kaj bi iz mene naredili.
And I decided
In sem se odločil,
that I was going to be very careful.
da bom zelo previden.
All these people believed the Bible.
Vsi ti ljudje so verjeli Svetemu pismu.
And I wanted to make sure
In jaz sem se hotel prepričati,
that nobody could say
da nihče ne bi mogel
at
reči
the end of my sermon
na koncu moje pridige,
that I preached anything but what was plainly taught in the Bible.
da sem govoril nekaj, kar je čisto bilo v Svetem pismu.
And that has been very important for me in my ministry.
In to je bilo zelo pomembno za mene, v moji misiji.
There is an English word, exposition.
In je angleška beseda
Exposition.
ekspozicija.
And there's another word, imposition.
In je tudi druga beseda impozicija.
Exposition is when you draw the meaning out of the text.
Ekspozicija je, da dobiš smisel iz konteksta, iz teksta.
And imposition is when you impose something on the text that isn't there.
Aha, impozicija je pa nekaj, da ti daš nekaj na tekst, kar sploh ni tam.
Often I hear sermons
Velikokrat slišim pridige,
that start off by reading a biblical text.
ki se začne z branjem enega odlomka Svetega
And
pisma.
then what is said afterwards has hardly any connection at all.
In
with the
potem,
text.
kar je kasneje govorjenega, sploh nima nobene veze s tem odlomkom, kar je bilo prebrano.
I hear other sermons
Potem slišim druge pridige,
where it's quite obvious
ki je čisto očitno,
that the preacher had certain things he wanted to say.
da ima pridigar ene stvari, ki jih hoče povedati.
His ideas.
Njegove ideje.
I want people to hear me.
Da bodo ljudje
I
slišali
want people
njega.
to know what I think.
Da bodo ljudje slišali,
My
kaj jaz
ideas are
mislim.
important.
Moje stvari so
Let them
pomembne.
listen to me.
Naj poslušajo mene.
And he prepared all these ideas.
In on pripravi vse te ideje.
And then he asked himself, now where can I find a Bible text which would support all
In
of this?
potem si reče, aha, kje lahko najdem svetopisanske odlomke, ki bo to
So he
podpiralo
starts
moje
with his
ideje. In
ideas
potem začne s svojimi
and then
idejami.
just tacks the Bible text onto this.
In potem najde tekst, ki bo to nekako podpiral.
That is not proper preaching.
In to ni pravilno govoriti.
People want to hear the word of God.
Ljudje bi radi slišali
They
Božje
don't want to
besede.
hear your ideas.
Ne bi radi slišali
They
vaše
want to hear
ideje.
what God is saying to
Oni bi
them.
radi slišali, kaj Bog pravi
What
njim.
God can do for them.
Kaj Bog lahko naredi za
How
njih.
God can help them in their daily
In
lives.
kako jim Bog lahko pomaga.
That's what they're interested
Delem
in.
življenje. To je, kar je Jezus učil.
And that's why you need to take the Bible text and open it up.
In zato je pomembno, da vzameš tekst Svetega pisma in da ga odpreš.
Now, there is a debate amongst people who write about homiletics as to whether all preaching should be expositional.
Je debata med temi, ki preučujejo homiletiko, je ali bi moralo biti pridiganje ekspozicijsko.
Some experts on homiletics say, no, we do need other types of sermons.
Nekateri strokovnjaki homiletike pravijo, da ne, rabimo še ene druge vrste pridig.
Because there are many problems today
Ker veliko problemov danes,
which cannot be dealt with
s katerimi se ne moramo srečati
on the basis of a biblical text.
jih rešiti s pomočjo teksta v Svetem pismu.
Now, for instance,
Naprimer,
what is our moral responsibility as regards global warming?
kakšna je naša odgovornost glede tople grede ali ogrevanja zemlje?
Yeah. There must be an expression that's got even for that.
Tople grede. Ogrevanje, ja.
Pregrevanje zraka.
I switched the television on to look at the news,
Sem vklopil televizijo, da bi pogledal
Sky
poročila.
News, and there was a Christian young man being
Tam je bil en
interviewed,
krščanski človek
and he was pushing very hard
in je zelo pritiskal,
for action on global warming.
da bi se nekaj naredilo glede tople grede, problem tople grede.
He was a representative of Tearfund, which is a Christian organization.
On je bil predstavnik Tilfant, ki je ena organizacija.
And the interviewer was saying, well, nobody's really taking any notice, are they?
In je v intervjuju rekel, da nihče se sploh za to ne zanima. Ne?
Nobody's really doing anything about this.
Nihče ničesar ne naredi glede
There isn't
tega.
a groundswell of feeling.
In lahko vidite, kako iz njega izhaja to.
And he said, well, that's not exactly true.
In potem on reče, ne, to ni
He
res.
said, we go around the churches talking about this.
Mi gremo okrog po cerkvah in govorimo o tem.
Christians are getting more involved.
Kristjani so postali bolj
And
vključeni
they're
v
starting
to.
to change things in their lifestyle
In bodo spremenili določene stvari v njihovih
so they
življenjih,
themselves will not contribute to
da
global
oni
warming.
ne bodo prispevali k problemu tople grede.
Now, how do you, on what biblical text would you base this?
Na katerem odlomku bi Svetega pisma bi to
There's
bi
no biblical text which
temeljili.
talks about global warming.
Noben odlomek ne govori o
It wasn't an
topli
issue
gredi.
in the past.
To sploh ni bil problem.
And so they say we need sometimes to have topical sermons.
In včasih moramo zaradi tega imeti tematske pridige.
Now there are many moral problems like that.
In to so potem lahko drugi problemi.
Things like abortion and contraception.
Problemi kot recimo splavi oziroma kontracepcija.
How do we deal with these questions?
Kako se srečujemo s temi vprašanji?
And
naprimer?
then there are doctrinal things.
In potem so doktrinske problemi.
There's a year in the church calendar,
Je cerkveno
sorry,
leto,
a day in the church calendar,
je dan v cerkvenem letu,
where we should be preaching about the Trinity.
ko moramo govoriti o trojstvu.
Well, on what Bible text? There's no Bible text that even mentions the Trinity.
Na kateri odlomek bomo govorili, ker nihče ne omenja niti en odlomek o
In
trojstvu.
order to build a doctrine of the Trinity,
In glede tega, kar je doktrina o trojstvu,
you need many Bible texts.
rabite veliko odlomkov Svetega pisma.
So, the question is then,
Vprašanje je potem,
can we have other types of sermons?
ali imamo lahko še različne druge pridige.
And I think we can.
In jaz pravim, da lahko.
One well-known
Ena zelo dobro poznana je,
expert in homiletics,
en zelo dobro
a man called Sangster,
strokovnjak na področju homiletike, Angster.
he suggests 6 types of
On je predlagal
sermons.
6 tipov različnih pridiganja.
Exposition is the first and the most important.
Ekspozicijsko je prvo,
But then he suggests ethical
druga je
sermons,
etiška,
like abortion would be such
kot
a issue.
recimo splavi.
And then doctrinal sermons,
In potem doktrinske,
which can take proofs from different parts of Scripture about a particular doctrine.
ki to lahko dokažete različnih odlomkov iz Svetega pisma.
He suggests apologetics type sermons.
Tudi pravi, da apologetijsko, oziroma branjenje
When
krščanstva.
someone is preaching to skeptics
Če nekdo govori s skeptikom
and he wants to explain to these people the truth of
in
Christianity,
bi jim rad razložil resničnost krščanstva,
and then there are these social political ones.
In potem je tudi politično,
like the one we just mentioned, global warming.
kot smo na primer omenili, topla greda.
And then evangelism,
In potem tudi zadnja točka,
The sermons-
evangelizacijsko.
which are directed at unbelievers.
Pridige, ki se namenjajo predvsem nevernikom.
And in America today, in the Willow Creek Church,
Danes v Ameriki v Willow Creek cerkvi
there's been a great emphasis on seeker services.
je bil velik poudarek na iskalcev službe.
On Saturday and Sunday,
Ob sobotah in nedeljah
the services are designed for new people coming in.
je bogoslužje namenjeno novim ljudem. da
And
pridejo
they
v
get
cerkev.
their Bible teaching during the week.
In skozi teden imajo pa proučevanje Svetega pisma.
So all these things are possible.
Vse te stvari so mogoče.
But all are agreed in principle that these things need to be firmly founded on the Scripture.
Je pa vse te stvari so pomembne, da se utemeljijo v Svetem pismu.
One of the most famous preachers in history was John Chrysostom.
Eden največjih govornikov v zgodovini je bil tudi John Chrysostom.
Ivan Zlatoust.
Janez Zlatousti.
Yeah, that's right. He has a book of sermons,
On je napisal knjigo Pridig
and they're so full of biblical quotations.
in je toliko polno citatov iz Svetega
He
pisma.
has 11,000 quotations from the New Testament
Uporablja 11,000 citatov iz Nove zaveze samo
and 7,000 from the Old Testament.
in 7,000 iz Stare zaveze.
Another very good use of biblical material
Ena zelo dobra uporaba različnih materialov
was used by Billy Graham
je bil uporabljen od Billy Grahama.
when he was making a point.
Ko je želel narediti en smisel, eno točko,
He would like have a machine gun approach with a series of biblical texts.
je imel en tak način kot brzostrelko z vrsticami Svetega pisma.
He learned a lot of texts by heart, Billy Graham.
Veliko stvari, veliko vrstic je on naučil iz srca.
And he would suddenly give this fire off about 5 or 6 Bible texts, which would prove his point.
In je s takim ognjem citiral vrstice Svetega pisma,
God
ki
says.
dokazale njegove stvari. Bog pravi
2, 3,
in samo
4,
1, 3,
5.
4.
The Bible can be used very effectively in that way.
Sveto pismo je lahko uporabljeno za zelo na mogočen način v takih stvarih.
And then persuasion.
In tudi
Have you got the
to je, mislim, da nekoga prepričaš. Prepričaš, ja.
What does it say?
Prepričanje ali da nekoga prepričaš. Prepričljivost. Da, hvala lepa. Ja, prepričljivost.
You're trying to win people over.
Želite ljudi doseči.
And the first thing about persuasiveness
Prva stvar, C2, samo. C2.
Spredaj, z druga strana.
I need to go to school.
Spodaj, C2.
Aha.
and the first thing about being persuasive is being clear.
Prva stvar, da si prepričljiv, da si jasen.
Paul says if the trumpet gives us an uncertain sound, who will prepare for battle?
Pavel pravi, da če bo trobenta dala en tak zvok, kdo bo pripravljen iti v boj?
You need to be clear.
Morate biti jasni.
And actually, it's much harder to be clear
In pravzaprav je veliko lažje biti jasen,
than it is to be complicated.
kot biti prekompliciran.
It's very easy to preach in such a way
Je zelo lažje govoriti v tej smeri,
that nobody has any idea what you're talking about.
da nihče nima ideje, o čem govoriš.
Jump from idea to idea
Da skačeš iz ideje na idejo,
without any apparent connection.
da nima nobene povezave med
There's
seboj.
a lot of preaching like that.
Ja, to je veliko pridig
And that has
na
to
tej smeri.
change.
In to se mora
There has
spremeniti.
to be a development of thought.
Mora biti en razvoj
And it must
mišljenja.
be clear as day.
In mora biti jasno.
And it's far better to take a little longer
In je veliko boljše, da vzameš malo več časa
and make something clear,
in da narediš ene stvari bolj
and to
jasne,
move on quickly,
da se hitreje
so
premakneš.
that the idea passes
Da recimo ideja lahko gre
and it's immediately forgotten.
in da je pozabljena.
We need to make the message clear.
Moram narediti stvar jasna,
You
sporočilo.
know, in my early years, I preached a lot in Banja,
V mojih zgodnjih letih pridiganja sem govoril v Banji.
and it was a very simple environment.
In je bilo zelo preprosto okolje.
Many of the people were illiterate.
Mnogi ljudje so bili nepismeni.
Yes, that's right.
Nepismeni.
And I had to work hard to be very simple.
In sem se trudil zelo o tem, da bi bil preprost.
And people listened
In ljudje so poslušali
like this.
s takimi velikimi ušmi.
I really enjoyed preaching there.
In sem užival pridigati tam.
But it took a lot of work to make it so simple that they would understand it.
In mi je vzelo veliko časa priprav, da sem lahko to pripravil tako preprosto, da so me razumeli.
And then a funny thing happened.
In ena smešna stvar se je kasneje zgodila.
I was invited to Novi Sad
Bil sem povabljen v Novi Sad
for a pastor's conference.
na pastorsko konferenco.
And I had to give some lectures there.
In tam sem dal nekaj predavanj.
And that was, of course, very different.
In to je bilo čisto drugo.
But there were some people from Banja there listening to these
In
lectures.
tam so bili nekateri ljudje iz Banje, da bi
And
poslušali
they
moje
came to me
predavanje.
afterwards.
In so prišli do mene na koncu
And they said, we can't believe how much you know.
in so rekli, ne moremo verjeti, koliko vi veste.
We thought you were a real simpleton.
Mislili smo, da ste zelo preprosti.
And you've got to risk that.
In to morate riskirati.
You're, as a preacher,
Kot pridigar
you're not there to show your knowledge.
niste zato tam, da pokažete svoje znanje.
You're not there to show your theological knowledge.
Niste tam, da pokažete svoje teološko znanje.
You know, you heard about maybe the theological student
Veste, mogoče ste slišali o teoloških
He
študentih,
came home to preach in his local church.
ki je prišel pridigati v svojo lokalno
He
cerkev.
said, today I'm going to preach on the arguments for the existence of God.
Danes se bomo pogovarjali o argumentih o obstoju Boga.
And he talked and talked and talked.
In govori.
And hardly anybody understood a
In
word.
nihče ga sploh ne razume niti ene besede.
And an old lady spoke to him after the sermon.
In žene so kasneje do njega prišle po bogoslužju.
And she said, in spite of everything you said,
V tem, kar si vse povedal,
I still believe in God.
še vedno verjamem v Boga.
Now, this is the danger.
In to je nevarnost.
And theological students, you know, they get a bit of knowledge and they want everybody to know
In
what
teološki
knowledge
študenti
they've got.
dobijo večkrat znanje in oni želijo, da bi vsi vedeli več.
It's true with homiletic
In to je
knowledge
tudi
as well.
pri homiletiki, znanje homiletike.
One thing that's very popular
Ena stvar je zelo pomembna
in English preaching
pri
is
angleškem
what's
prediganju.
called alliteration.
Je,
Alliteracija. Yeah,
kdo ve?
Rečeš aliteracija.
Aliteracija. Bomo slišali, kaj je to.
basically what it means is that each of your main points
V bistvu je to, da vsaka tvoja točka
is a word that begins with the same letter.
je beseda, ki se začne za isto črko.
I never use it.
Jaz to nikoli nisem uporabljal.
Not long ago it happened to me by accident
Nedolgo se je to zgodilo meni,
that my three main points began with the same letter.
da so se moje točke glavne začele za isto črko.
But it's almost like doing a crossword puzzle.
Ampak to je isto, kot da bi delal
You
križanje.
know, people enjoy showing, you know, how they have got everything with the same letter.
Ljudje radi pokažejo, da se vse začne za istimi
And
črkami.
sometimes they squeeze words in that don't really fit.
In včasih dajo s tiste ene besede, ki sploh ne gre noter.
But they're showing off their homiletic knowledge.
In oni s tem kažejo svoje homiletiško znanje.
Your purpose is not to show your knowledge to people.
Vaš namen je, da ne pokažete znanje ljudem.
Your purpose is to make the word plain.
Ampak vaš namen je, da pokažete besede, da igrajo, da razumejo.
Then logical arguments and proofs.
In potem so tudi logični pristopi in dokazi.
You must have a sense of logic if you're going to preach good sermons.
Če hočete dobro pridigo govoriti, morate imeti tak logični pristop.
Do the different parts of the sermon logically relate to one another?
Da se točke v pridiganju, da se ujemajo z drugim, drugo z drugo.
Do they logically follow one another?
A se logično ujemajo, sledijo drugi.
If you're wanting to prove a point,
Če bi radi dokazali eno točko
and you quote a biblical text,
in citirate svetopisanski odlomek,
does that text really prove what you're trying to say?
ali res to dokaže to, kar želite povedati?
Have you properly understood it?
Ali res ste pravilno jo razumeli?
So you need to work in this area as well.
Morate tudi v tej smeri tudi delati.
This is part of clarity.
To je nekaj glede jasnosti.
There was a great preacher in the middle of the 20th century, a man called Martin Lloyd-Jones.
Je bil govornik Martin Lloyd-Jones.
And Martin Lloyd-Jones usually preached for about an hour and a half.
In on je govoril, pridigal je okrog uro in pol.
There were very few little stories in his sermons.
In v njegovi pridige ni bilo veliko zgodb.
But nevertheless,
Ampak nikoli
he had a very large church with several hundred people in the center of London.
Ampak imel je pa veliko ljudi, ki so v središču
And he had a very powerful and effective ministry
in imel zelo mogočno svoje delo, misijo,
throughout the United Kingdom.
skozi Veliko Britanijo.
And many of his sermons have been published.
In veliko od njegovih pridig so bile v knjigah.
And this man could hold your attention for an hour and a half.
Ta človek bi lahko resnično 1 uro in pol drži vašo pozornost.
With difficult material,
Z težkim materialom,
but it was so clearly presented,
ampak je bilo tako jasno predstavljeno,
so logically ordered,
tako logično v zaporedju,
that as you listened to him,
da ko ste ga poslušali,
you could pretty well guess what was coming next.
ste lahko že kar ugibali, kaj bo naprej sledilo.
And there was this feeling that you were being led to great truths.
In je bil ta občutek, da ste bili vodeni v velike resnice,
That he's leading you out of confusion,
da vas pelje stran od zmede,
avoiding all the pitfalls,
da se izogiba vse te prepreke
and leading you right on to the heart of the truth.
in da vas pelje točno v srce resnice.
Now, it's true that it was largely an intellectual congregation.
Res je, da ni bilo ne vem kakšna veliko znanje o tej
They were
cerkvi.
mostly professional people who were listening to his messages.
So bili predvsem zelo znani, izobraženi ljudje.
But the logical development of thought,
In logično zaporedje misli,
it brings a kind of aesthetic delight to listeners.
prinaša eno tako zelo dobro poslušanje poslušalcev.
Aesthetic delight.
Ja, estetska.
You know, people like to watch football.
Ljudje radi gledajo fuzbal.
I like to watch a good match.
Jaz tudi gledam dobro tekmo.
And when you see somebody do something really brilliant,
In ko vidite, da nekdo naredi res nekaj čudovitega,
there's a sort of sense of aesthetic appreciation.
je ena taka estetska zahvala. Čudovana.
The thing is done so well.
Ampak stvari, ko ne grejo tako dobro.
Something similar happens when a sermon is put together well.
Tudi nekaj takega se recimo zgodi, ko je dobra pridiga pripravljena.
Most people don't know how the preacher managed to put it together so well.
Veliko ljudi ne ve, kako je pridigar sestavil pridigo tako dobro.
But they know it was done well.
Ampak oni samo vejo, da je bilo zelo dobro
And they get a
narejeno.
similar feeling like watching a brilliant player.
In ima isti občutek, kot recimo gledajo enega čudovitega igralca.
Like Ronaldinho or somebody like that.
Ronaldinho.
Making a brilliant move.
Ko naredi čudovite
And
gibe
scoring a brilliant goal.
in da da dober gol.
So, get a development of thought which is logical.
Se pravi, dati en dober, logični zaporedje, da je res smiseln.
There are all kinds of ways,
So različne stvari,
all kinds of methods you can
različne
use
metode, poti, ki jih lahko uporabite.
in oratory. Oratory? Govorništvo. Retorika.
Retorika v govorništvu.
there are all kinds of methods you can use.
Različne metode, ki jih lahko uporabljate.
And we don't really have time to go into many of these details.
Žalost, nimamo časa, da bi šli v vse te detalje.
But they are important. I do need to say something about this.
So zelo pomembne, ampak rad bi še nekaj povedal glede tega.
There must be some kind of emotion.
Da mora biti eno čustvo.
Now this is a difficult question.
Ampak to je zelo eno težko vprašanje.
Billy Graham was attacked a lot.
Billy Graham je bil veliko napaden.
For manipulating people with emotion.
Od manipulacijskih ljudi, ki so bili z čustvi.
He said, they said to him, you have this choir in the background.
Da imate, so mu rekli, da imate v ozadju ta zbor.
And they're singing this nice song.
In poje lepo pesem.
And all the time you're persuading people to come
In
forward.
ves čas pozivate ljudi, da pride naprej.
So Billy Graham said, okay.
In Billy Graham je rekel, v redu.
He said, I'm going to stop all this.
Bom ustavil vse to.
And he stopped having the choir.
In je ni
And
več
he
bil
stopped
zbora.
talking.
In je nehal
He
govoriti.
just gave a very simple appeal.
In dal je samo eno preprosto
He
poziv.
wanted to show
In je želel
that it was the
pokazati,
Spirit of God that was bringing
da
people
je bil
forward.
Božji duh tisti, ki pripelje ljudi
And
naprej.
not emotional pressure.
Ne pa ta čustveni pritisk.
Now, there are dangers and there are preachers who use emotional manipulation.
So nevarnosti, ker nekateri pridigarji uporabljajo te čustvene manipulacije.
We have to be aware of that.
Moramo se tega zavedati.
But on the other hand,
Ampak tudi na drugi
if
strani,
we are not excited about what we believe,
če mi nismo navdušeni nad tem, kar verujemo,
if it doesn't create enthusiasm in us,
če v nas ne naredi enega navdušenja, enega entuzijazma,
we're not going to create enthusiasm in other people.
tudi ne bomo ustvarjali enega entuzijazma v
So I
drugih.
would say, if you're sharing your emotion,
Torej, jaz bi rekel, če vi delite vaše emocije
and that emotion is authentic,
in so te čustva res resnične, iskreni,
then you are not manipulating people.
vi ne manipulirate ljudi,
You're just sharing your heart.
vi samo delite svoje
And
srce
what
z njimi.
effect it has on them
In kakšen efekt ima na njih?
cannot be considered manipulation.
In ne morejo temu reči, da je to bila manipulacija.
And the other thing is the will.
In še druga stvar je želja.
We do want to persuade people.
Ja, radi, da bi prepričamo ljudi.
We want them to make a decision.
Radi bi, da naredijo
We
odločitev.
want them to do something.
Želimo, da bi nekaj naredili.
And we need to tell them that.
In moramo jim to povedati.
But we mustn't pressurize them
Ampak ne smemo delati pritisk na njih
in a wrong way.
na napačen način.
Let me give you an example.
Naj vam dam en primer.
You get a preacher who
Recimo,
says,
imate pridigar, ki
he says,
govori,
now, at the end of the sermon, he says,
zdaj na
now,
koncu te pridige,
if you want to give your heart to Jesus,
če želite dati svoje srce Jezusu,
he said, let's all bow our heads.
poklonimo svoje glave,
Nobody looking up.
nihče gor gledati.
He said, now while we all have our heads bowed,
Zdaj, ko bomo vsi sklonjene glave,
if you want to receive Jesus,
če želite sprejeti Jezusa,
just raise your hand.
dvignite roko.
Nobody is watching.
Nihče ne gleda.
And maybe some people think, well, nobody's watching.
In nihče si misli, nihče ne gleda.
Maybe, I can. So they raise their hand. He
Lahko
says, thank
mogoče
you
jaz
very
lahko
much.
dvignem roko, ker nihče ne gleda. In potem
And
reče, hvala lepa.
then he says, he finishes that
In
period.
potem, ko
He says, now
konča ta,
all of you have stood up.
in vsi tisti, ki ste ostali,
All of you who
vsi tisti, ki
have
ste
raised your
dvignili
hand.
roke,
You will now stand up.
vsi tisti, ki ste dvignili roke, zdaj ostanite.
And everybody's looking up.
In vsi jih gledajo.
And he said, now you will come down to the front.
In zdaj pridite naprej.
To me, that is manipulation.
Zame je to recimo manipulacija.
There's been quite a lot of that in this part of the world.
In je bilo, tega se je dogajalo veliko na tem delu zemlje.
It's not been much from people who live here, but usually from people in America.
Ni bilo veliko strani ljudi, ki so živeli tukaj, ampak strani ljudi, ki so prihajali iz
They
Amerike.
travel
Oni so prihajali,
and they receive money for this traveling that they do around the world.
ki so potovali in so sprejeli denar, ki so potovali po
And they
svetu.
need to go back and say 500 people
In so šli potem nazaj v Ameriko, in so rekli, 500 ljudi je prišlo k Kristusu,
during my sermons.
ko sem govoril.
So they get as many people to the front as possible.
In tako želijo čim več ljudi,
And
da
they
pride
can't
naprej in da jih potem šteje.
was once talking about this, and one of the students came to me.
In ko sem enkrat to govoril, en študent na koncu prišel do mene.
He was from a big church in a Slovak village in
On je
Vojvodina.
prihajal iz ene velike cerkve iz
He
Slovaške.
said one Sunday afternoon we had such a preacher.
Eno popoldne smo imeli v naši cerkvi
There
nekega takega
wasn't one
govornika.
unbeliever in the place. There wasn't one unbeliever in the
Ni
place.
bilo niti enega vernika tam.
We were all baptized believers.
Smo bili vsi sami verniki.
But he made an appeal.
In on je naredil
And he
poziv.
went on and on.
In je govoril in govoril poziv.
So in the end,
In na koncu
some of us said, well, let's go forward and go through this process
nekateri da
so
smo
we
rekli,
can
"Pojdimo
finish the service and go on.
gremo naprej, da bomo končali že to bogoslužje. Gremo lahko domov."
But we do need, from time to time, to give people a chance to make a decision.
Ampak od časa do časa je pomembno, da damo en čas, odločilni čas, poziv ljudem, da se odločijo.
In our church, I do it maybe 5 or 6 times a year.
Jaz, recimo, v moji cerkvi naredim 5-krat, 6-krat na leto.
I don't do it every Sunday.
Ne delam to vsako
I
nedeljo.
think it loses its meaning if you do it
Se mi
too.
zdi, da zgubi en pomen, če to delaš
But
vsakič.
from time to time, I do give people an opportunity
Ampak od časa do časa dam ljudem možnost,
to publicly confess that they want to give their lives to Jesus Christ.
da javno pokažejo in povejo, da želijo predati svoje življenje
And I
Bogu.
think that is a tremendous help to people.
In se mi zdi, da to zelo pomagalo
But
ljudem.
it must be their decision.
Ampak mora biti njihova odločitev.
We cannot manipulate them into it.
Ne smemo jih manipulirati.
And it's better to make it difficult.
In je boljše, da naredimo bolj zakomplicirano.
I know it's difficult,
Vem, da je težko,
but if you're really serious about this,
ampak če ste resni
come
glede
out
tega,
in front of everybody.
pridite naprej pred
Say,
vsemi
I want to follow Jesus
in
Christ.
rečete, jaz želim slediti Jezusu Kristusu.
To me, that's much better than this step by step.
Za mene je to veliko boljše, če kot pa korak po koraku. Da jih.
Then, application.
In tudi na koncu še aplikacija, poraba življenja.
Now, all these things are important.
Vse te stvari so pomembne,
But if I had to single out one thing
ampak če moram podariti recimo eno stvar,
that is very, very important,
katera je zelo, zelo pomembna,
it would be application.
bi bila to aplikacija, uporaba.
People are sitting there in the pews.
Ljudje sedijo v klopeh.
They don't want to hear your latest theological ideas.
Nočejo slišati tvojega zadnjega teološkega znanja.
They want to know, what does God have to say to me for my life?
Radi bi slišali predvsem, kaj Bog želi za mene, za moje življenje.
And there are all kinds of problems there.
In potem se tukaj različne problemi.
I took a list
Tukaj sem si naredil en seznam
out of one book
iz ene knjige,
that talks about these things.
ki govori o teh stvarih.
And he gave this list. It's not an exhaustive list,
In on je dal en seznam, ni ne vem kako velik list,
but it gives you an idea of the sort of things that people are struggling with.
ampak daje samo en seznam problemov, s katerimi se ljudi, s kakšnimi problemi se srečujejo.
Loneliness,
Osamljenost,
shyness,
sramežljivost,
fear of failure,
strah pred padcem,
dissatisfaction in work,
nezadovoljstvo pri delu,
shortage of money,
da nimaš dovolj denarja,
sexual problems.
da imaš spolne probleme.
I remember once, when I was in university, the sexual revolution was just starting.
Ko sem bil na univerzi, se je začela ta seksualna revolucija. Ja.
And I saw an advertisement in the Students' Union.
In sem videl en oglas na...
There was a big placard on the wall,
Je bil velik plakat na steni
and at the top it said, sex!
in na vrhu je pisalo seks.
And then below it he said, now that we have got your attention,
In potem od spodaj pisalo, zdaj ko imamo vašo
we
pozornost,
wish to announce a meeting of the Archaeological Society.
bi radi informirali, da imamo arheološki sestanek.
When you talk about sex, you'll certainly have people's interest.
In če govorite o seksu, boste imeli sigurno veliko zanimanja ljudi.
Because it's such a universal problem. for
Ker je
people.
tako svetovni problem.
There are very few people that in some way or another don't have a problem, he said.
Ni veliko ljudi, ki bi imeli s tem, ki ne bi imeli s tem problemom.
Celiba. Moving house.
Selitev, recimo, da se seliš.
I've heard it said, and I heard this in Croatia,
Slišal sem recimo to na Hrvaškem,
moving 3 times
da če se seliš 3-krat,
is like being burnt to the ground once.
je kot da bi še enkrat začel.
Enkrat pogorel.
Da bi pogorel. Tako, ja.
The upbringing of children,
Vzgajanje otrok,
problems in communicating love,
problem komunikacije ljubezni,
getting old,
staranje.
starting to be a problem for me.
To je zdaj mogoče problem za mene.
Looking after old people,
Skrb za starejše ljudi,
your life's dream,
tvoje življenjske sanje.
an awful lot of disappointed people around.
Veliko je razočaranih ljudi okrog nas
They had some kind of dream for their life.
in imajo sanje za svoje življenje, kaj bi radi.
What does the Bible have to say about that?
Kaj pa Sveto pismo glede tega zapovedati?
They had a great dream and it never came to pass.
Imajo velike sanje in nikoli se niso uresničile.
So many things went wrong.
Toliko stvari je šlo narobe.
What about the suffering of the innocent?
Kaj pa recimo trpljenje ubogih, nedolžnih?
On the Sky News yesterday,
Na Sky Newsu sem včeraj gledal,
there was a report of a man
je bilo ena reportaža enega človeka,
who took a 6-year-old girl
ki je vzel 6-letno punco
out of her bath.
iz kopanja, ko se je kopala,
He raped her
jo je posilil
and threw her out into the street where the temperature was around freezing.
in ko je bila zunaj temperatura pod nulo, jo je peljal ven.
You know, when I hear things like that,
In ko slišim takšne stvari,
I say, God, what are you doing? What are you allowing?
si rečem, Bog, zakaj te stvari dopuščaš?
I don't know if you have those feelings too.
Ne vem, če imate vi takšne tudi
But the
občutke,
suffering of
kateri
the
se
innocent.
srečate. Ampak trpljenje
And there's
nedolžnih,
so much of it going on throughout the world.
ki se trenutno zdaj dogaja vse posod po svetu.
What happens after death?
Kaj se zgodi po smrti?
Bereavement.
Žalovanje za umrlimi.
Personal appearance. Osobni izgled.
Aha, osebni izgled, ja, kako izgledamo.
How do you feel when you look in the mirror?
Kako se počutite, ko se pogledate v ogledalo?
I've got quite a few things I would like to change.
Jaz sem nekaj stvari, ki bi rad spremenil.
I'm just hoping for the resurrection, you know.
Jaz samo čakam na vstajenje.
Makeover.
Ja, preobrazba.
Problems with dominant parents.
Problemi z starši.
Feelings of inferiority.
Občutki manj vrednosti.
Problems in interpersonal relationships.
Problemi, ki se vmešavajo v odnos.
Feeling that you're stupid or ignorant.
Ja, čustva, občutki, da ste neumni ali da ste zaničevani.
Tiredness.
Utrujenost.
I know people that are chronically tired.
Poznam ljudi, ki so kronično utrujeni.
Boredom.
Da so dolgočasni.
It's a major problem today amongst young people, especially amongst those that haven't managed to get a job.
Danes je problem med mladimi, da težko dobijo
Well, that's
službo.
just a few of the things.
To je samo ena stvar od teh stvari.
Now, your preaching
Vi govorite,
has to take the word of God
je treba, da vzamete Božjo besedo
and show people
in da ljudem pokažete,
that it is relevant to their problems.
da je relevantno, uporabno za njihovo življenje.
And I said I would say something more about Joyce Meyer.
Rad bi še nekaj povedal glede te govornice Joyce Meyer.
Through a very long and difficult life,
Skozi dolgo, težko življenje
where she's made a lot of mistakes,
in naredila veliko napak.
she sought the Lord's answer for these problems.
je našla pri Bogu rešitve.
And her sermons consist of the answers that she received from the Lord.
In je dobila odgovore od Gospoda.
And how she was able to get the victory
In kako je ona dobila zmago
in these extremely difficult
v
problems.
svojih težkih trenutkih, problemih, ki jih
She
je imela.
talks about her relationship with her husband
Govorila je o odnosu s svojim možem
and the things that make her mad
in stvari, ki so jo naredile jezno.
and the things that she does to her husband which make him mad.
In tudi stvari, ki jih je ona naredila
And the
do moža
same
in
in
tudi
the
njega naredila
relationships
jezno.
with the children.
In iste odnos, ki je naredila do svojih otrok.
How she makes them mad.
In kako ona njih
How they
naredila
make her
jezno.
mad.
Kako so otroci njih naredili jezno.
So she's very open about all of
Je
this.
zelo odprta glede tega.
And people recognize their problems.
In ljudje prepoznajo svoje
They say this
probleme.
person, you know, knows all about my problem.
In ta oseba ve o vseh mojih problemih.
And then she has them.
In tukaj jih
And
ona
she said,
pridobi.
you know, there's an answer to this.
Uh,
And it's found in the Word of God.
in Gospod ima
If you
odgovor za
start
vse.
doing this, If you start doing
Ja, če
this,
boste delali tako,
practicing this,
delajte tako,
you will change your life
se vaše življenje bo
and you will be
spremenilo
victorious.
in boste zmagali.
And I know
In jaz vem,
because I've done it.
ker sem tako naredila.
See what
Vidite, kako pomembno
application
je,
is.
da
And
apliciramo
how
stvari.
possible it is to preach a sermon
In pomembno je recimo pri pridigi,
that has no application at all.
da če ni nobene aplikacije, da ni aplikacije.
There was a famous preacher in America called Harry Emerson Fosdick.
Je bil en slavni govornik iz
Fosdick.
Fozdek.
He had a system of preaching
On je imel en tak sistem,
which was based on human problems.
ki je temeljil na človeških problemih.
And he had 4 steps.
In je imel 4 korake.
The first step was to talk about a human problem
Prvi korak je bil, da govori o problemih človeka.
and win over the interest of his congregation for that problem.
In da to pridobi
You know,
svoje občinstvo v svoji cerkvi.
when you're a preacher, you'll see these things happening.
In ko boste vi recimo govorili, boste videli te stvari se dogajati.
You start to talk about a particular thing and you see people turn around.
Ko govorite določene stvari, ljudje delajo tako, in je res.
You see maybe you're talking about a problem in marriage and you see a couple turn
Ko boste
around.
govorili o svojih problemih po zakonu, ljudje boste videli,
You know
da
that
bojo dvigne z glavo.
you're getting through.
In vidite, da jih dobivate, da greste prav.
You've got their interest.
Imate njihovo
But this
zanimanje,
is a particular problem.
ko delite probleme.
Well, how to solve it?
Kako jih rešiti?
And then the next step in this process,
Naslednji
this
korak
first
v tem
step,
koraku je,
second step,
drugi korak,
is to show the failure of human attempts to solve these
je
problems.
pokazati problem, da človek tega ne more sam rešiti.
And the third thing
In
is
tretji
to
korak
then
je,
to bring in the biblical text.
da pripelješ odlomek iz Svetega pisma.
Now you see, this is an exposition.
Vidite, to ni ekspozicijsko.
You begin with the problem.
Začnete z problemom.
The problem is what you start with.
Problem je, s katerim začnete.
And his preaching is criticized, of course, on
In
this.
njegovo pridiganje je bilo kritizirano glede tega.
I'll tell you how I think it should be done in a
Bom
moment.
povedal malo kasneje, zakaj, kako bi moglo biti.
And the fourth thing
In četrta
is
stvar
then to encourage people
je, da bi spodbudil ljudi,
to put into practice the biblical way of solving the
da
problem.
bi uporabili svetopisanski odlomek v njihovem življenju, da bi rešili problem.
Now, as I say, this is not proper exposition,
Kot sem vam povedal, to ni pravilna ekspozicija.
but what you can do,
Kar pa lahko naredite je,
which is a much better approach,
kar je veliko boljši pristop,
is to describe in the introduction this problem. To describe the problem
da opišete problem
in the introduction.
v samem uvodu.
So you first of all read your text,
Prvo preberete odlomek,
and then you talk about the problem,
govorite recimo potem o problemu
and then you say to the people, now what I want to do today
in potem povete ljudem, kaj bi danes naredili je,
is to tell you
da bi vam povedal,
how this biblical truth is going to solve your problem.
kako lahko ta biblijska resnica reši vaše probleme.
So you catch their interest.
In pridobite njihovo
And then you
pozornost.
expound the text.
In potem razvijete odlomek.
Then we need to go to the end.
Moramo iti, kakšen je naš končni cilj.
Oh, wait a minute, I've still got something to do here.
Aha, še malo, nekaj imamo še zapovedati pri tej stvari.
Another area where we need to think about our listeners
Še ena smer, kaj moramo paziti pri naših poslušalcih,
is their worldview.
je njihov svetovni nazor, svetovni pogled.
Now, there are churches still
Danes še obstajajo cerkve
in Croatia
na Hrvaškem,
where women have to wear a covering on their heads.
ko morajo žene nositi pokrivalo.
And there is a biblical text that talks quite clearly about that.
In je odlomek v Svetem pismu, ki jasno o tem govori,
The women should cover their heads.
da bi
in
žene
worship.
morale pokrivati glave na bogoslužju.
This brings us to questions of exegesis and hermeneutics.
Tukaj se potem srečamo z problemom eksegeze in hermeneutike.
There are certain things
So določene stvari,
that we have to leave in the first century.
ki jih moramo pustiti v prvem stoletju.
People have made a big thing of just about every biblical text you could imagine.
Ljudje so naredili razne stvari iz biblijskih citatov, kar se je dalo mogoče.
But nobody has ever, as far as I know,
Nihče ni, kakor jaz vem,
made anything of the biblical text where Paul says to Timothy, bring me the books.
naredil iz odlomka, kjer Pavel pravi Timoteju, prinesi mi knjige.
Automatically, you leave that in the first century.
Avtomatično to pustite v prvem stoletju.
You know that even if you could go and find these books, which is very doubtful,
Veste, da če boste šli in da boste našli te knjige, kar je zelo
you
dvomljivo,
certainly couldn't bring them to Paul.
in sigurno ne boste mogli prinesti Pavlu, ker ga ni več tukaj.
Now that's in the Word of God.
To je v Božji besedi.
Some people would say it's the Word of God, you've got to do it.
In če Božja beseda pravi nekateri, da moraš
And
potem
they
to
say
narediti,
that about the veil on the head.
in to jim že pravi, to pravi potem tudi glede
But the
pokrivala.
fact of the matter is
Ampak stvar pri tem je,
that some things have to be left in the first
da
century.
nekatere stvari moramo pustiti v prvem
They're
stoletju.
not applicable to us today.
Niso uporabne za danes, za
You
danes.
can't apply them to people.
Ne morete jih aplicirati danes pri
If
ljudeh.
you're going to apply the Word of God to your people,
Če boste aplicirali Božjo besedo danes pri
you have
ljudeh,
to take the principles
morate vzeti princip,
that are involved.
ki je
So,
tam.
for instance, if somebody gave me that text
Naprimer, če bi mi nekdo dal ta tekst
and said, preach a sermon on this text,
in bi rekel, pridigaj na ta odlomek,
what would you do?
kaj bi vi naredili?
I know what I would do.
Jaz vem, kaj bi jaz naredil.
I would say, well, I would talk about the friendship and the
Yeah.
fellowship that existed.
Jaz bi govoril o
Between
prijateljstvu
Paul
in
and Timothy.
odnosu, ki je obstajal med Pavlom in Timotejem.
Of the fact that because they knew one another so well and loved one another very much,
Ker ste zelo dobro drug drugega poznali in ste se imeli radi.
it wasn't a problem to ask things of one another and expect them to be done.
Ni bil problem glede stvari, kako bi moglo biti narejene.
Paul felt free to ask,
Pavel se je počutil svobodnega, da bi ga prosil.
and our fellowship should be such that we are free to ask.
In naš odnos bi mogel biti tak, da smo svobodni drug do drugega.
And also, we can probably assume that Timothy was glad to do that.
In predvidevam, da je bil Timotej vesel, da je to naredil.
Paul was his mentor.
Pavel bil njegov mentor.
He would be glad to do an act of service.
On bi z veseljem naredil kakšno delo služenja.
You're taking the eternal principle
Vzamete ta princip
and leaving the details that are not applicable
in pustite detalje, ki niso mogoče uporabne za danes nas.
today. Now, I looked into Gordon Fee's commentary on 1 Corinthians.
Sem pogledal na Gordon Fees komentar na 1. Korinčanom
He is one of the world's top experts.
On je eden vrhunskih
For the first letter of Corinthians.
za prvo pismo Korinčanom.
And he analyzes that text
In on analizira ta tekst.
and says that we have absolutely no idea
In piše, da mi nimamo pojma,
what the cultural situation was in Corinth.
kakšna kultura je bila v Korintu.
We don't know
Ne vemo,
why Paul said it was a shame for a woman to worship with her head uncovered.
zakaj Pavel pravi za ženske, da je sramota, če nimajo glave pokrite.
But what we do know was,
Vemo pa,
it was something in the culture of the time.
da je bilo nekaj glede njihove kulture v tistem času.
There are other churches, for instance,
So, recimo druge cerkve,
where ladies are not allowed to wear trousers.
kjer ženske niso dovoljene nositi hlač.
If you don't come in a skirt, you will be asked to leave.
Ja, če ne boste nosili kiplo, boste zaprošeni, da zapustite.
Now, they would appeal to the Old Testament,
In oni bi to se nanašali na odlomke stare zaveze,
where it says that it is offensive to God
kjer pravi, da je
for a woman to wear, for anybody to wear the clothes of the opposite sex.
da ni prav, da nosi nekdo oblačila nasprotnega spola.
This is in the Old Testament,
To je v stari zavezi
and a condemnation of a sexual perversion called transvestites.
in obsodba teh stvari kot transvestiti.
It is nothing to do with the present state of fashion.
In nima nobene stvari danes opraviti z modo.
I mean, if we were going to insist on the fashion,
Če bi ustrajali recimo na modi,
then it should be men that are wearing dresses.
potem bi morali biti moški tisti, ki bi morali nositi.
We need to go back to the time when the Old Testament was written.
Mogli bi iti v čase nazaj, kjer je bila stara zaveza napisana.
Well, men were wearing dresses,
Ko so moški nosili halje.
and so we would all have to come to church in dresses.
Bi mogli vsi prijeti moški v haljah.
But we don't. We come to church in trousers.
In ne pridemo v tem.
Why?
Pridemo vsi v
Because
hlačah.
fashions have changed.
Zakaj? Zato, ker se je moda spremenila.
And what's important is the principle.
Kar je pomembno, je princip.
And transvestites deliberately want to deceive.
Ampak transvestiti, oni načrtno želijo to spremeniti.
A school friend of mine,
Moj šolski sošolec
after school joined the Navy.
je po šoli se je pridružil vojski.
He wasn't a Christian.
Ni bil kristjan.
And he was looking for a prostitute.
In je iskal prostitutko.
And he found a good-looking girl.
In je našel lepo punco.
But it turned out that this girl was not a girl at all.
In v bistvu se je potem skazalo, da ta punca sploh ni
But it was
punca.
a man disguised as a girl.
In je bil moški kao punca.
That is what the Bible is condemning.
Ja, to je Sveto pismo. Govori
It's
proti
not
temu.
calling us back to fashion.
Nas ne kliče nazaj modi.
It's not calling us back to the fashions of bygone days.
Ja, ne kliče nas nazaj, da gremo nazaj v tiste mode v božjem času.
So we as preachers
Mi
have
kot
to make this
govorniki
jump
moramo narediti ta skok
from the first century
iz 1. stoletja
or earlier
ali še malo prej
to the 21st century,
v 21. stoletje,
to the age of computers
v obdobje računalnikov
and space travel.
in potovanja v vesolje.
And how do we make that jump?
In kako naredimo ta velik skok?
Now that branch of theology is called hermeneutics.
Ta korenina se imenuje tega področja hermenevtika.
And we have to bear in mind what one expert in hermeneutics has called two horizons.
In moramo imeti v mislih ti dva horizonta.
The writers of the New Testament
pisci Nove zaveze
had a worldview that was different
so imeli svetovni nazor, ki je bil drugačen
from ours.
od našega.
And we have to take the eternal principles that they taught,
Moramo vzeti ta princip,
take them from the scripture,
vzeti ga iz Svetega pisma
and bring them into the 21st
in da
century.
ga damo v 21. stoletje.
So this in practice means, ladies,
To v praksi pomeni, drage žene,
that you can come to church with trousers.
da ne morete priti v cerkev z zaklačen,
You can come to church without a covering over your head.
lahko pridete s hlačami, lahko pridete za pokrivali.
It's okay.
V redu je, brez pokrival.
Lei come tu dici?
But the principle
Princip,
of not dressing in such a way
da se da oblačite tako,
to attract the wrong kind of male attention,
da bi privlačili nasprotnega spola.
that remains.
To še vedno ostane. Da se
You want to look
oblačite tako.
nice,
Želite lepo
but
izgledati,
you don't want to look seductive.
ne želite pa, da bi izgledali izzivalno.
And dressing like a prostitute today
In da se oblečete danes kot prostitutke,
is very different from what it was in the first
je
century.
zelo drugače, kot je bilo v prvem stoletju.
So the standards of behavior, the outward form changes,
Standardi so se spremenili, to, kar je na zunaj.
but the principle remains.
Ampak princip ostane.
So in our preaching, we need to make this jump from the first century
V našem pridiganju moramo narediti ta velik skok iz prvega
into the
stoletja
21st.
v 21. stoletje.
How are we for time? Wow, I've been speaking for an hour. You have to stop me, you know.
Morate me ustaviti.
The students know this, you must.
Študenti v Osiku
They
vejo.
know that I'm like a train, you know.
Oni vejo, da sem kot vlak.
Like a ship that once it gets going.
Odganja pa enkrat gre, ne moreš ustaviti.